Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Dan, Warpaint JKU. In this video, I'm going to show you guys what it takes to properly measure and locate a rear axle so that you can figure out how far you want to stretch it. Now, stay tuned and watch because these measurements and things also apply to the front of the vehicle as far as the basic way we're measuring. But there's some things we need to think about in the rear of the vehicle to make sure that our axle is going to live happily under there. And we're going to get to it. So let's go check it out. A lot goes into stretching an axle, right? If we were to stretch it in the front, on top of all the measurements that I'm going to show you guys in a little bit, you'd also have to think about things like steering geometry and things like that. And leaving your factory steering box in the factory location kind of limits you on how far forward you can stretch it. But the other limiting factor is the track bar, okay? Now, if you're watching this video, you probably already know what a track bar is. I'm not going to get into it. But on the front axle, without relocating and moving that track bar, you run into some issues when you're trying to move that front axle forward. Well, the same thing is an issue in the rear of our Jeep. So today I'm going to focus on the rear, but a lot of these same things apply to the front of the vehicle as well. Now, I've already stretched the front of ours, and having leaf springs and not having to use a track bar made it even easier to stretch it even farther forward. But in the rear, we're going to get down to it, and we're going to talk about how much stretch we're going to give this thing and exactly how to measure it. Okay, so there's a number of different ways to figure out axle placement on the rear of your Jeep or even on the front of your Jeep. But as soon as you lift a Jeep, all that stuff kind of changes, right? Because when you look at a normal axle on the ground under a lifted Jeep, your control arms come down from over here on an angle. And your rear suspension kind of moves in a little bit of an arc. So your axle will actually go backwards as you compress the suspension. So if you're comparing your vehicle in your garage to one maybe out in your driveway or one out on the trail or a friend's, you have to take the lift into consideration. Now, luckily, we are building Project Maple Leaf to actually have about the same lift height as Warpaint. So we want a little bit more rear stretch than Warpaint has. I basically went outside, I took a plumb bob, okay? I hung that plumb bob from the center of my bump stop cup and just used gravity to hang it straight down. Now I know Warpaint has about a 1-inch stretch, maybe slightly less in the rear, because that's really all you can get away with without relocating your factory track bar in the back of the Jeep. But with that 1-inch stretch, this at ride height for my lift height, the plumb bob basically hits dead square on the center of the axle tube. So we're going to mark that location now, knowing that that's about a 1-inch stretch for our goal lift height. And then we're going to move the axle back from there to give us a little bit more stretch. Using that same plumb bob I mentioned before, I hung it from the center of the bump stop cup in the same place, put some tape on the floor, and once I had it nice and steady, I marked the location. After marking both sides of the Jeep off the bump stop cup, it was time to basically find the center point between the frame rails so I could make sure that the axle was centered under the vehicle. This is what happens in a normal everyday guy garage. We got to take this 14-bolt axle and kind of get it in between all this junk without it crushing our feet, get it under that Jeep. Now to better help figure out our spring mounting locations and lift height, I wound up putting this 14 bolt on jack stands on top of casters, setting it at the height it would be with the 40 bolted on. All right guys, so here we are. Obviously you saw me starting to wheel it over here. We had our marks on the floor right under the bump stop over here. I also did a mark on the floor, same way you saw hanging the plumb bob, centering it between the frame. Now I did find the center point on the axle. I marked it on the diff cover and lined it up to make sure that our axle is completely centered under the frame of the vehicle. And it is, right? So at this point, it is set up at the same point that war paint is. We'll confirm that by going from a body mount to the center of the axle tube, being that it's the same axle under the same kind of Jeep. And at that point, basically, this is going to be our rough ride height. So that right there, even though we didn't have a swap truss kit to line up coil springs, even though we didn't have control arms made to locate it, so if you were basically making your own control arms, at this point, you'd be able to just measure from the brackets and bolt hole to bolt hole, cut them to length, weld the tube, and make your own. And that's kind of how you're going to set up your stretch. Now, ours is obviously going to be a little bit different because we're putting a leaf spring in here, but we're going to kind of be more married to a position than we would be if we had an adjustable control arm. But being that we can kind of put it anywhere on the frame that we want to, we do have some adjustability, but we want to get it right the first time, right? Because if we put it in the wrong spot, we can't adjust it again without cutting it all off and re-welding it all on. Again, possible, but not as easy as adjusting a control arm. But anyway, guys, locate an axle under a vehicle, right? Just kind of hang some plumb bobs, mark some spots on the floor in relation to where the vehicle frame sits. Take those same marks, kind of transfer them to your axle, finding the center point, line it up, slide it in, and that's kind of where it goes. And then you just got to take your measurements for your suspension like we just talked about. Anyway, guys, there's a ton of videos coming up, a lot of more common things too that more people are going to be interested in. So stay tuned, make sure you hit that subscribe button, share this with a friend if they're going through a similar project. A lot of the times you can think about this kind of stuff 15 different ways and it starts to get confusing and you kind of screw yourself up mentally about it unless you have a lot of experience. It's really fairly simple. Don't overthink it. Check your math, do it, measure once or measure twice, you know, hang your plumb bobs, make sure, just double check everything and you'll be good to go. All right. Anyway, guys, get out there and build something.